One by one, the once great Christian centers abandoned Christ and bowed to the new faith. As the Christian church was shilly-shallying about the precise nature of Christ, as they dotted each I and crossed each T in the creeds, so Islam spread unchecked. The holy city itself, Jerusalem, fell. To the affront of Jew and Christian alike, the Dome of the Rock was erected. No images of Allah or his prophet Muhammad adorn its walls, but there is splendor enough. So how would the papacy, with their newfound allies the Normans, face the followers of Muhammad? Power dominated the imagination of the papacy, and it had to be asserted in the East and the West. It captured the spirit of Cardinal, Archdeacon and monk Hildebrand.
Of all the cities in the world, Jerusalem has the most troubled past and the most troubling future. To the Jews, it is the site of the great temples of Herod and Solomon. To Muslims, the place where Muhammad ascended to heaven. To Christians, the place where their Messiah was crucified. After his death, the word of Jesus Christ took root, and Jerusalem slowly shed almost 4 centuries of Roman occupation to embrace Christian rule. But in the 7th century, the holy city was forcibly seized by a new faith, Islam. Now, 400 years later, the Christians wanted Jerusalem back. Across Europe, some 60,000 warriors were gathering, readying themselves for battle. One of the leaders was veteran warlord Duke Godfrey of Bouillon. He would head up his own army on what would become a 3-year crusade across 3,000 miles to reclaim Jerusalem in the name of God. Godfrey was more than just an acclaimed fighter. A generous benefactor of the Catholic Church, he was also an immensely pious man.
As far as I'm concerned, there's one key thing that's driving people to take up the cross, and that is that they actually believe that this crusade is a spiritual war and that it's going to purify their souls of sin. And yes, I'm sure they've got other agendas, they've got other things they're looking for at the same time, but if there's one thing that's at the core and that it's across the largest range of people, it's spirituality, it's religion that's driving this.
The Franks, which was the catch-all word for everyone who participated in the Crusades, were regarded for many centuries until this day as barbarians who came to destroy the peak of Islamic civilization. And this is a very strong thing which goes down right to this day. So the word crusade is electric, and people know it. They know what happened in that world.
There was good reason why men would risk everything to journey to a distant land from which they might never return. Blighted by famine and racked by petty wars, their European homeland was a cursed place. They craved a better life in this world and the next.
I think if you were to take a time machine back to the late 11th century, the first thing that would probably strike you is what a violent society it was. We're at a time when sort of central government's not very well organised, the great monarchies of France and Spain haven't developed. It's petty lordships, local castellans, they raid, they fight, they scrap one another. It's a time of endemic lawlessness.
One of the most learned men in Christendom painted a disturbing portrait of this chaotic world. A senior archbishop and a consort of kings, William of Tyre wrote the history of the Crusades as he saw it.
In nearly all the circle of the earth, belief had failed. The fear of the Lord no longer prevailed among men. Justice had perished from the world. Violence held sway among the nations. Fraud, treachery, and chicanery overshadowed all things. All virtue had departed and ceased to exist as useless. Evil reigned in its stead.
There was only one organization with the potential to stem this anarchy: the Church. The Catholic faith dominated 11th century Western Europe.
The world of the Middle Ages was a world that was deeply concerned with matters of religion, and it's almost impossible for us in a secular age today to overestimate how concerned they were. It's almost impossible for us to understand how concerned they were.
People are bombarded with the fact that they are threatened by sin from all forms of life. Just about everything they can do in life is potentially sinful. It's literally as if the air they're breathing is contaminated with a sin.
The Church could absolve a man of his sins, but it lacked the political muscle to wash away the ills of an entire society. Feuds with the secular rulers of Europe had pushed the papacy to the sidelines until 1088, when a new pope arrived in Rome, Pope Urban II.
Pope Urban was an astute individual, a man who understood the political and social and religious currents and needs of his time, someone who knew how to bring those things together and channel them into productive outlets.
Pope Urban needed a master plan to put the Catholic Church back on the political map. The answer to his prayers would come in the form of a desperate plea for help from an old rival. In 1095, a desperate call for help was dispatched to the head of the Catholic Church, Pope Urban II. Sent from the imperial court of Constantinople, it came from his Eastern Christian rival, the political master of the Greek Orthodox Church, the Byzantine Emperor Alexius I. The power of Alexius's empire was slipping. The influence of his Orthodox Church had once stretched as far as the Holy Land of the Middle East. Islam was now the dominant force in the region. The Seljuk Turks were recent converts to Islam. They had emerged from the steppes of Central Asia and swept down into the Middle East in search of land. Fearsome warriors. Their armies numbered tens of thousands. They seized control of the Muslim territories of Persia, Syria, and Palestine, and finally captured the holy city of Jerusalem. Then they turned their gaze north and stormed their way to the doorstep of the great Byzantine capital, Constantinople.
The status quo, the existing power politics, the power balance of the region was changed. The Byzantines had lost a great area of taxation, of recruitment for troops. They'd lost a lot of prestige as well.
By 1095, the Emperor Alexius was desperate to strike back. But he couldn't do it alone. He appealed to the Pope, in the spirit of Christian brotherhood, to send an elite force of knights to help him keep the Turks at bay. It presented Pope Urban with a perfect opportunity to enhance his political power.
You've got to understand that the popes of that period were politicians. much more so than they are now. Even now, the current Pope intervenes in politics all the time. But at that time, the popes were big players, scheming, manipulating, intriguing, politicking. They were basically the politicians of the church.
Pope Urban was set to hijack the misfortune of the Byzantine Empire. He would launch his own holy war against Islam. A crusade that would strengthen his papacy and put Rome back at the center of the world political stage.
The idea of the Crusade satisfies a number of particular agendas for the Pope. It allows him to increase his authority over the knighthood of Western Europe at the expense of other secular rulers. It directs the violent knights away from their practices of brutalizing the church in the West. It also rolls back the infidel. It begins to allow the Christians to reclaim the holy places.
In November 1095, the Pope performed a spellbinding open-air sermon outside the town of Clermont in France. It was a rallying call to princes, knights, clerics, and the common man to wage a war under the banner of the Catholic Church.
Urban must have been a remarkably charismatic and effective speaker. Being at his speech must have been like being at some kind of mass rally, a Billy Graham crusade, a pop concert, something like elements of all of those things together. There were thousands and thousands of people there.
His sermon was a cunningly crafted piece of religious spin, spiced with exaggerated tales of Muslim atrocities against Christian pilgrims living in the Holy Land. It demonized the Turks and presented the crusade as the apocalyptic war of two faiths.
His words seemed to proceed from God and were received by young and old alike eagerly as a command from on high. The cradle of our faith, the native land of our Lord and the mother of salvation, is now forcibly held by a people without God. For many years now, the wicked race of Saracens, followers of unclean practices, have oppressed with tyrannical violence the holy places where the feet of our Lord rested. Dogs have entered into the holy places. Priests have been slain in the sanctuaries, virgins forced to choose between prostitution and death by torture.
The emotional intensity of the moment was very high, and when the end of the speech was reached, Urban gave an appeal, and people came forward from the crowd to take the cross, literally to take strips of cloth and to put them on their clothing, over their breast, over their heart perhaps, and to indicate that they were taking vows and were going to go to the east to rescue their brothers.
Inspired by the possibility of great prestige and honor, tens of thousands of men and women, families, even whole villages took vows to join Pope Urban's crusade. But for many, like the young knight who wrote an eyewitness account of his journey to Jerusalem, there was another attraction: the promise of great riches.
Our Lord the Pope said if anyone wished to save their souls, they must not hesitate to undertake with humble spirit the way of the Lord. And if he did not have a great deal of money, divine mercy should provide for him. Then he said, take the road to the Holy Sepulchre. Rescue that land from a dreadful race. Rule over it yourselves, for that land floweth with milk and honey.
Nothing is ever motivated purely by religion or ideology. They knew perfectly well that there was a lot of wealth in that part of the world. It was the center of trade. All the trading caravans passed through this world, and so they wanted the money. It was as simple as that.
But the lure of unimaginable wealth and the chance to seize lands that was said to flow with milk and honey was just the beginning. News soon spread of an even greater incentive. Pope Urban took an unprecedented step. He offered to those who pledged their souls to the crusade a ticket directly to heaven.
For those of you who once fought against brother and relative, now rightfully fight against the barbarians. Know then that whoever sets out on this journey not out of lust for worldly advantage, but only for salvation of his soul and liberation of the church, is remitted in entirety all penance for his sins.
Pope Urban marketed the crusade brilliantly. He struck a number of chords that the knights of Western Europe wanted to hear. He said, look, you're living these violent lives. If you don't atone for your sins, you're going to go to hell. What the crusade offered was a way of carrying on fighting and also receiving a spiritual reward. That was the deal. If you went on crusade, you got the remission of all your sins. You would not go to hell.
The Pope's sermon pushed the boundaries of Christian teaching. In his holy war, a crusader now had the blessing of God to ignore the sixth commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," as long as he was an infidel.
This is violence which God actually wants, and he wants it so much that he's actually going to give a spiritual reward to people who participate in it. It's literally like opening Pandora's box. I'm not sure he's actually conscious of how dangerous an idea he's tampering with at Clermont. But what it leads to is a very powerful upsurge of a sense of hatred of the outsider, if you like, in Western Europe, and a turning against anyone who seems to be other than what is an accepted norm, a Western Christian.
Before the crusade had even left Europe, Christian fanatics swept up by the Pope's words hankered to spill blood. To these fundamentalists, any non-Christian was an infidel, and the infidels were all around.
But the pilgrims rose up in a spirit of cruelty against the Jews. They inflicted a most cruel slaughter on them, claiming that the killings would be of service against the enemies of Christianity. They attacked them, decapitated many. They destroyed their homes and synagogues, and even divided all the looted money amongst themselves.
Across Europe, thousands of Jews were massacred in the name of God. Murder and slaughter of the innocent had become the hallmarks of the First Crusade. In the autumn of 1096, almost a year after the Pope's sermon, armies from France, Germany, and Italy set out on the epic 3,000-mile march to aid their Christian brothers and liberate the Holy Land from Muslim rule. At the helm of the largest army from Northern Europe was Duke Godfrey of Bouillon.
Godfrey was one of the senior leaders of the First Crusade. He was a very pious man. In fact, we know that he brought a number of monks with him on the expedition to help him in his daily prayers. He was also a great warrior. He'd won repute before the Crusade for his feats in single combat, and he was a respected man who the leaders of the expedition felt they could all deal with.
At Godfrey's side was his younger brother Baldwin, the Count of Boulogne. Ruthless to the core, Baldwin had once been destined for the priesthood, but had turned instead to a love of women and war.
Writers talk about him being plagued by lust and the sins of the flesh. We said to be quite discreet about all of this, but it is an aspect of his character. He's also a very pragmatic man, and somebody who would not hesitate to brush aside others if they crossed him.
Following in the footsteps of Duke Godfrey and Count Baldwin, military historian John France uses 11th century sources as his guidebook. These medieval records reveal the harsh realities of life on crusade.
To take the cross must have been very, very expensive. We know that people sold land, we know that they mortgaged land. They seem to have tried to raise about 6 years' income just to live through the crusade. A rich man would have had a whole retinue. He'd have come, with his household, with everybody who would normally accompany him. And possibly wives. It's often forgotten that many wives came with their husbands because they too were inspired by this remarkable opportunity for salvation. So what you have on the crusade is a sort of city, as a whole society, moving eastwards towards Jerusalem. The problems of feeding that are absolutely immense. I mean, it is almost inconceivable how they did it. We would guess that they stole stuff, but fundamentally they were probably buying from the local peasants who would be glad to sell, but at very high prices.
For almost 6 months, Godfrey's Crusader army lumbered across thousands of miles, over the rivers and mountain ranges of Eastern Europe. They finally joined forces with other Christian armies from the south at the agreed rendezvous point, the spiritual heart of Eastern Christianity, Constantinople. Constantinople is today known as Istanbul, the bustling showpiece of modern Turkey, and a largely Muslim city. But 900 years ago, perched on the most easterly tip of Europe, it was the last Christian city before the Crusade ventured across the Bosphorus into enemy territory. Then, the jewel of the city was the great Orthodox Christian cathedral of St. Sophia. Covered in mosaics of burnished gold, it was a vivid testament to the legendary wealth of Constantinople. But the Crusaders would scarcely get a glimpse of it. The Byzantine capital was surrounded by 2 concentric rings of thick stone wall, more than 10 miles round and 30 feet high. To friends of his realm, the emperor would throw open the triumphal gates and usher them into the heart of his city. But to the mass of crusaders, they remained firmly closed.
Well, here are the remains of the magnificent Golden Gate, one of the 10 entrances to the city of Constantinople. This was originally a triumphal arch. You can see the 3 elements of the arch here. It reminds one a little bit of the Arc de Triomphe. Atop this structure, you would have had 4 bronze elephants, and around it there would have been a series of friezes depicting the deeds of the classical heroes of antiquity. When the Crusaders arrived out here, these doors would have been shining and dazzling, and of course closed before them.
The gates had been sealed on direct orders of the Emperor Alexius. He was furious. A Catholic army of 60,000 was not what he had in mind when he asked Pope Urban to send an elite team of mercenaries.
What he required was a group of about 300 knights, well-trained, well-armed, that he could direct where he felt the threat was greatest. What he got was something completely different, something that he did not remotely in his wildest dreams expect to receive. Tens of thousands of fanatical, armed men who descended upon him like a series of pests, locusts coming down, in fact, is how one chronicler describes it. And they came down and they approached his great city, wave after wave after wave.
The swarm of soldiers sent by his rival, the Pope, and now camping outside the gates, was large enough to mount an attack on the city. He couldn't afford to offend them. But Alexius could see a way to manipulate events to his own advantage.
The Emperor Alexius was a wicked and crafty man. He played the part of a scorpion, which when met face to face is harmless, but the tail of which is barbed with a poisonous sting it is well to avoid.
the emperor invited the principal commanders of the crusade into his lair, the inner sanctum of the imperial palace. Alexius was confident he could win over Duke Godfrey and his brother Baldwin. But they had now been joined by another crusade commander. Bohemund of Taranto was the aggressive eldest son of a family of Norman mercenaries who had recently taken control of southern Italy.
He was somebody who attracted attention through his appearance and through his bearing. He was perhaps the greatest warrior of the whole expedition. He was said to have the ferocity of a lion, a starving lion, charging into a group of sheep.
Bohemund's experience in war was invaluable. He had already battled against the Muslims in Sicily and won. But for years, he had also been fighting with the Byzantines. But Bohemund, like the other Crusader leaders, was a better soldier than a politician. They were all about to be outwitted.
When the emperor heard that Bohemund, that most distinguished man, had arrived, he ordered for him to be received with proper ceremony. Then, once he'd settled in, with the Duke Godfrey and his brother Baldwin, he invited him to a secret conference. He planned how to entrap these Christian knights by fraud and cunning.
Alexius had lost much of his empire to the Turks. He wanted to win these lands back, not see them passed on to this rival Catholic army. The emperor still had one trump card up his sleeve.
When they are in his lands, the one thing that they need is food. They're an army that is unprepared. It doesn't have supply chains like modern armies do. It's not all planned out ahead. They've got to live off the land. So Alexius can control and give them markets if they play the game. If they don't play the game with him, then he can withdraw those markets, and they are going to start suffering quite badly. It may provoke an outburst of bad behavior from them. They might start trying to ravage the land, but they realize sooner or later, because he has all the food, they've got to start doing business with Alexius. He knows that, and they know it too.
In return for his promise to supply food, each of the three Crusader leaders was forced to swear an oath of allegiance to the emperor. By that oath, they granted Alexius a commanding role over the whole campaign and vowed to return to his empire and the Eastern Orthodox Church any lands that they might win back from the Turks. The entire Crusader army was ferried across the Bosphorus by their new partners, the Byzantines. Soon they would be in enemy territory for the first time, and this fragile alliance would be put to the test. With Constantinople behind them, the Crusaders still had over 1,000 miles of hostile territory to cross before they reached Jerusalem. After only a few weeks, in May 1097, they reached the first enemy-held city. Nicaea, today known as Iznik, had once been a Byzantine city. But 20 years earlier, it had been seized by Turkish warlords and was now the fortress capital of the new Sultan, Kilij Arslan.
Over the northern hills is where the Crusader army came from. They marched down from Constantinople, over the hills, and fanned out round the city, clamping it in an iron siege. Finally, the moment of conflict. And they must have been pretty excited, pretty hepped up. This was the enemy. This is where it's all going to start.
Breaking their way into Nicaea would not be easy. A thick 3-mile-long wall enclosed 3 sides of the city.
Attacking a city like this is really pretty difficult because these walls are very formidable. You can see them here, 10 meters high roughly, the towers here 30 meters apart. That means whatever way you approach the wall, people have got you in their sights as a very good, very easy target.
For 6 weeks, the Crusaders besieged Nicaea. The fighting was intense, but morale in the Christian camp was high. They were on the verge of their first victory. though the Crusaders had promised to return the city to the Byzantine Emperor Alexius' control, they expected to keep the riches of Nicaea for themselves. But their Byzantine allies were about to pull the rug from under their feet. Along the western flank of the city lay the great Ascanian Lake. Here, early on June 18th, 1097, emissaries of the Byzantine Emperor initiated a secret plan to take the city and its spoils for themselves.
The Byzantines had brought their ships onto the lake to help in the siege, but they used their ships for a quite different purpose. They secretly contacted the Turks within the city. They would much sooner surrender peacefully to the Byzantines than be chopped up into little pieces by the Crusaders, who were obviously thirsting for their blood. And when morning breaks, there on the battlements of the city are the imperial flags flying. The city has surrendered.
The sight of the Byzantine imperial banner flying above the city ramparts incensed the Crusader army. They had been double-crossed by their so-called Christian brother, Emperor Alexius.
When Alexius did that deal with the Turks and took Nicaea for himself, the Crusader army felt utterly betrayed. They were furious. The man who they trusted, who was supposed to be their ally, who they would have to trust on the future fights through Turkey and into the Holy Land, had gone behind their backs. This was a very, very bad sign for the future of the Byzantine Crusader alliance.
Robbed of the spoils of Nicaea, the Crusaders packed up their camp and ventured deeper into enemy territory, heading towards Jerusalem. But they were not alone. From the hills, the Turkish Sultan Kilij Arslan shadowed their every step. He had just lost his fortress city. Now, he wanted revenge.
Kilij Arslan, mindful of the injury done him, constantly brooded over the fact that through the Christians he had lost the excellent city of Nicaea. With all his heart he yearned to retaliate and determined to lay an ambush for his enemy.
The Turkish leader would unleash the full might of his fighting force, more than 50,000 men. Scouting the land just ahead of the Crusader army, he found the perfect site for a surprise attack. The epic clash that took place here has become part of Crusader lore. It is known as the Battle of Dorylaeum. Though many have tried, to date, no one has found the real battle site. But John Franz has spent years sifting for clues and now thinks he can pinpoint its exact location.
We know certain things about this battle, but finding it is a different matter. We know that it took place at a junction of two valleys. We know there was a marsh, but the thing that we really know is that this junction of two valleys must have provided an immense amount of space, because at one stage both armies deployed in full battle array, and that takes a lot of room.
Professor Franz is taking the same road used by the Crusaders in 1097. Back then, it was so narrow they could only travel 5 abreast. With 60,000 men, the procession took 3 days to pass any given point. As a result, a vanguard of 20,000 men led by Bohemond became separated from the main body of the army. They ended up camping alone and vulnerable in the very valley chosen by Kilij Arslan for his ambush.
This is really getting very flat and open. And I think this looks like a place where two valleys meet. In fact, it really looks like a place where two valleys meet.
35 miles from Nicaea, John France reveals for the first time the long-lost site of the Battle of Dorylaeum, the first major battle of the Crusades.
This really is it. You've got to take away all the modern earthworks, this road. This is a flat plain at the junction of two valleys. It fits all the pictures, it's even slightly damp underfoot. This is it. This is where the battle took place, and we're standing on one of the really decisive battlefields of the Crusading era.
At dawn on July 1st, 1097, tens of thousands of Turks mounted a head-on attack against Bohemund's vanguard force camped alone on the valley bed. At last, on the real battle site, Professor Franz can see exactly how the epic struggle unfolded.
They were all mashed up in the camp, here by the jeep, desperately trying to get their defences up, and charging up at them, up the valley floor, are the Turks.
For one man who fought at Dorylaeum, it was a day he would never forget.
Bohemond said to his men, "Gentlemen, brave soldiers of Christ, you can see that we are encircled and that a hard battle lies ahead. Therefore let all knights go out like men and meet the enemy."
With the Turks streaming through the camp, the Crusaders were pinned down. No matter how many Turks they killed, they were losing more men. As wave after wave of Turkish cavalry swept towards them, they now faced a style of warfare they'd never encountered before. These were no ordinary riders. These were archers mounted on horseback.
The Seljuk Turks were really first-class archers and very courageous. They attack very quickly. They're very light, unlike the Western European knights. They have smaller horses. They don't carry too much armors. They were really clever in shooting arrows from the back of the horse, riding at a very fast speed.
This startling new tactic was decimating Bohemund's vanguard force of 20,000 men. But mounted archers were not the only surprise the Turks had in store.
The Turks surrounded us on all sides, throwing darts, casting javelins, and shooting arrows from an astonishing range.
Just how the Turks fired from so far away has never been understood. But buried away in a little-known Muslim text of the time, Dr. Taif al-Azhari has discovered an obscure reference written in ancient Arabic that may solve the mystery. The Naukia.
The Naukia were a battalion inside the Turkish army of arrow foot soldiers. The soldier lay down with his back to the ground, and he used a huge bow with both muscles of his legs and fired a couple of 100 meters away. Sometimes in the sources we have stories like the sunlight disappeared for a couple of seconds because of the sheer number of the arrows.
Bohemund had already lost some 4,000 men, and now the Turks were closing in for the kill. Desperately, he ordered his men to hold the lines around the camp. But from beyond the valley, help was at hand.
The greater part of the army, under those illustrious and splendid men, Duke Godfrey, his brother Baldwin, and other warriors devoted to God, was advancing swiftly to the aid of their brethren.
With the armies of Godfrey and Baldwin pouring into the valley, the Crusader force swelled to 55,000 men.
The Turks found themselves, potentially at least, between an anvil and a hammer. And rather than face that, they broke and fled, very sensibly.
The sheer number of the combined Crusader force had overwhelmed the Turks.
But it has to be said, the Turks fought brilliantly. Who would ever have praised so much the Turks, said one of the Crusaders, who were such fine soldiers, and had they been but Christians, would have been the equal of us.
The Crusaders believed they were now invincible. One confidently wrote home to his wife to say they should all be at the gates of Jerusalem.
Ships, local castellans, they raid, they fight, they scrap one another. It's a time of endemic lawlessness.
One of the most learned men in Christendom painted a disturbing portrait of this chaotic world. A senior archbishop and a consort of kings, William of Tyre wrote the history of the Crusades as he saw it.
In nearly all the circle of the earth, belief had failed. The fear of the Lord no longer prevailed among men. Justice had perished from the world. Violence held sway among the nations. Fraud, treachery, and chicanery overshadowed all things. All virtue had departed and ceased to exist as useless. Evil reigned in its stead.
There was only one organization with the potential to stem this anarchy: the Church. The Catholic faith dominated 11th century Western Europe.
The world of the Middle Ages was a world that was deeply concerned with matters of religion, and it's almost impossible for us in a secular age today to overestimate how concerned they were. It's almost impossible for us to understand how concerned they were.
People are bombarded with the fact that they are threatened by sin from all forms of life. Just about everything they can do in life is potentially sinful. It's literally as if the air they're breathing is contaminated with a sin.
The Church could absolve a man of his sins, but it lacked the political muscle to wash away the ills of an entire society. Feuds with the secular rulers of Europe had pushed the papacy to the sidelines until 1088, when a new pope arrived in Rome, Pope Urban II.
Pope Urban was an astute individual, a man who understood the political and social and religious currents and needs of his time, someone who knew how to bring those things together and channel them into productive outlets.
Pope Urban needed a master plan to put the Catholic Church back on the political map. The answer to his prayers would come in the form of a desperate plea for help from an old rival. In 1095, a desperate call for help was dispatched to the head of the Catholic Church. Of all the cities in the world, Jerusalem has the most troubled past and the most troubling future. To the Jews, it is the site of the great temples of Herod and Solomon. To Muslims, the place where Muhammad ascended to heaven. To Christians, the place where their Messiah was crucified. After his death, the word of Jesus Christ took root, and Jerusalem slowly shed almost 4 centuries of Roman occupation to embrace Christian rule. But in the 7th century, the holy city was forcibly seized by a new faith, Islam. Now, 400 years later, the Christians wanted Jerusalem back. Across Europe, some 60,000 warriors were gathering, readying themselves for battle. One of the leaders was veteran warlord Duke Godfrey of Bouillon. He would head up his own army on what would become a 3-year crusade across 3,000 miles to reclaim Jerusalem in the name of God. Godfrey was more than just an acclaimed fighter. A generous benefactor of the Catholic Church, he was also an immensely pious man.
As far as I'm concerned, there's one key thing that's driving people to take up the cross. And that is that they actually believe that this crusade is a spiritual war and that it's going to purify their souls of sin. And yes, I'm sure they've got other agendas, they've got other things they're looking for at the same time, but if there's one thing that's at the core and that it's across the largest range of people, it's spirituality, it's religion that's driving this.
The Franks, which was the catch-all word for everyone who participated in the Crusades, were regarded for many centuries until this day as barbarians who came to destroy the peak of Islamic civilization. And this is a very strong thing which goes down right to this day. So the word crusade is electric and people know it. They know what happened in that world.
There was good reason why men would risk everything to journey to a distant land from which they might never return. Blighted by famine and racked by petty wars, their European homeland was a cursed place. They craved a better life in this world and the next.
I think if you were to take a time machine back to the late 11th century, the first thing that would probably strike you is what a violent society it was. We're at a time when sort of central government's not very well organised, the great monarchies of France and Spain haven't developed. It's petty law.
One by one, the once great Christian centres abandoned Christ and bowed to the new faith. As the Christian church was shilly-shallying about the precise nature of Christ, as they dotted each I and crossed each T in the creeds, so Islam spread unchecked. The holy city itself, Jerusalem, fell. To the affront of Jew and Christian alike, the Dome of the Rock was erected. No images of Allah or his prophet Muhammad adorn its walls, but there is splendor enough. So how would the papacy, with their newfound allies the Normans, face the followers of Muhammad? Power dominated the imagination of the papacy, and it had to be asserted in the East and the West. It captured the spirit of Cardinal, Archdeacon and monk Hildebrand.